Hi, everyone. Good afternoon or good morning. My name is Tracy, and I'm on the marketing team at Indicative. Welcome to our second webinar on the modern data ecosystem. Today, we're with Indicative's co-founder and CEO, Jeremy Levy, who's sitting down with Tejas Manohar from Hightouch and David Crevitt from Fishtown Analytics, the makers of DBT, to discuss how to set up your organization for the modern data stack. We'll cover three topics during the webinar: an introduction to DBT and Hightouch, the rise of the modern data team, and emerging trends in the modern data ecosystem. Before I turn the stage over to Jeremy, I did want to mention three things. The webinar is being recorded, so at the end of this webinar, you'll get a unique link that you can use to go back to listen to the recording of this event. There's a window on the right side of your screen. There are three tabs. One is the chat. That's where you can send the questions for Jeremy, Tejas, or David, and we'll get to the Q&A at the end. We'll leave 10 minutes for Q&A. So submit your questions at any time. There's a poll in the second tab. There's a question in there right now, so please do answer that question. And then the third tab is a handouts tab. In there is an infographic of the best-in-class tools in the modern data stack, and it's a great resource for you guys to have, so go ahead and download it at your leisure. And then lastly, for those of you who are not currently using Indicative, we have a link to a free trial at the conclusion of the event. Stick around for it. And if you're not familiar with Indicative, Indicative launched in 2014. We're a product analytics platform built to connect directly to a company's data warehouse, and Indicative's used by product managers, data analysts, growth marketers to analyze complex behavioral data without the need for SQL or code to increase customer engagement, conversion, and retention. So with that, I will turn it over to Jeremy to take the stage.
Thanks very much, Tracy. I want to first welcome David and Tejas for joining us today. Hey guys, how are you?
Hey, doing well. Thanks for having us.
Definitely. So I want to start, David, with you. As I understand your background, you were originally a data consultant before you moved over to DBT, and I thought it was interesting how your background somewhat mirrors the evolution of how DBT spun out of an analytics consultancy. It'd be great if you could give a quick introduction on yourself, your background, and then also tell us what is DBT.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here. So if we even go back further from when I started doing data consulting, which tracks to about the time that DBT started or came out back in 2016, back in about 2010, I started my career at BlackRock in New York City doing analytics for banks, basically. And that was, if we could talk about like legacy data stack, that was as legacy as you could imagine. You know, we had all of our own data centers, extremely centralized team, and we were kind of doing analytics engineering before it was called analytics engineering, if that makes sense. So we went from like an extremely legacy stack, they weren't using anything open source, to when I left, they started adopting open source. And it became clear after I left there that cloud data warehouses becoming widely available and relatively cheap, data ingestion tools that allowed you to get a lot of data into those warehouses, and then DBT, the kind of transformation layer on top of those two. Those three combined made it very clear that, wow, you can really do high grade, kind of like enterprise grade BlackRock style data pipelining with a team of one. Right. So at that point, I went out and started doing consulting. DBT, if for those who aren't familiar, is a data transformation framework that allows you to run data models on your warehouse, written purely in SQL with some Jinja spice and some additional flavor on top of it. But the kind of core innovation is that anyone who knows SQL, which is a lot of folks, right? A lot of data analysts, data engineers can now transform data in their warehouse without having to, throw transformation tasks over the fence to another team, if that makes sense.
Thank you. David, I want to come back to that notion about how SQL has sort of made what DBT does available to more people. But before we do that, I want to introduce Tejas. Tejas, you have an interesting background as well. As I understand your background, you were formerly an engineer at Segment before you started HighTouch. I'd love to hear about your background, as well as tell us, what does HighTouch do and what problems does it solve?
Yeah, thanks for introducing me, David. Or sorry, thanks for introducing me, Jeremy. So I'm Tejas, one of the founders of HighTouch. Before working at HighTouch, I actually worked at a company called Segment. Segment actually aimed to solve very similar challenges to HighTouch, just in a very different way. So when I joined Segment in 2016, the data warehousing ecosystem actually looked very different. It couldn't be an assumption that most startups we worked with at Segment had a data warehouse. Yet alone, today we expect companies to have model data in a data warehouse and already BI tools spun up and things like DBT. That just wasn't the state of the world back then. So the way Segment aimed at solving the problem of business users don't have the right data and the right tools when they need it, whether these are marketing tools or sales tools or support tools. The way Segment actually aimed to solve this problem was to provide companies a single API where they could collect information about users and what they're doing in your various applications in a very specified way. And then Segment would have an opinion of how this data is mapped to different systems, whether that's a Salesforce or an analytics tool or a marketing tool or a support tool or anything of that nature. What I found over time at Segment was that many of the challenges companies were running into, especially companies with more mature data stacks, was that Segment and this single API of collecting all user information wasn't really the source of truth when it came to customer data or just data in general at a company. BI, SQL, and the data warehouse were increasingly becoming the source of truth, especially with companies adopting cloud data warehouses like Snowflake and BigQuery and tossing things like DBT on top. It was really clear that the gravity of data in an organization lend itself towards that direction. So that's why we founded HighTouch, which basically helps companies move data into the tools where business teams live via SQL and via the data warehouse as the source, rather than making people change the way that they're collecting, instrumenting, or modeling data today. If you want a field to show up in Salesforce populated about your users live, you can do that with just a SQL query.
So you guys have both touched on this notion of cloud data warehouses and the modern data stack. Let's level set for everyone in this conversation and our audience. Tejas, what is this notion of the modern data infrastructure or modern data stack?
Yeah, so the notion of the modern data stack is basically every time any sort of technology area, whether it's data or anything else, goes through a wave of change, there's usually a lot of tools that come up as a result. And it's hard for consumers to figure out what exactly fits where and where all the pieces fit together. So the notion of a modern data stack is basically to serve as a guide for companies to see how different solutions in this new stack that's being created on top of cloud data warehouses in particular, like Snowflake and Google BigQuery, how all these solutions coming up in the market, whether they're for data ingestion, for operationalization of data, for analytics, for machine learning, for BI, how all these solutions actually fit together and can be put together to create a tool set at your company to solve data challenges at large. I think the notion of a modern data stack is very powerful and allows companies to look towards a guide or look towards a reference point to see what the integration points between all this software is, to see how it all fits together, whereas usually just looking at the sites of these companies individually, it's very hard to decipher if you're completely new to the space.
David, I'm going to ask you a question now about sort of this notion of the modern data infrastructure. From my perspective, it seems like really within the last maybe 6 to 14, 18 months, has the notion of it becoming the best way for companies to manage their data become a standard, or at least something that's well understood. What has driven this transition to where cloud data warehouses and this modern data infrastructure are now the best way to do this? Cloud data warehouses are not new, but what's changed that sort of made this come to be the standard?
I think to some extent, it's kind of a sign of maturity in the ecosystem. And speaking from like a DBT perspective, I think the adoption of DBT as a de facto standard for codifying your data transformations, once you have kind of a standard configuration that lots of teams are using, then it becomes really straightforward, to integrate with that and build around it, right? I'm sure Tejas can speak more about that with regard to high touch. But I think it's really like a sign of maturity that the interoperability of all of these pieces is really becoming straightforward and an expectation of consumers versus having to to build everything monolithically.
Tejas, did you want to add something there?
Yeah, I think the biggest shift is that basically the cloud data warehouse coming into mainstream existence and popularity, and I guess lastly also accessibility. Like there were some attempts at cloud data warehousing like Amazon Redshift before, but it really wasn't until BigQuery and Snowflake entered the market that this technology became super easy to administer and super accessible for the wider market. And with that notion, a lot of the previous ways people did things, whether it was ingestion or transformation of data, or even things like BI, started to change because new possibilities were unlocked by this fundamental layer, which is the cloud data warehouse. For example, prior to DBT on a more modern data stack, like with a BigQuery or Snowflake, there did exist solutions to transform data in the warehouse before and ingest data and move it out. Like Informatica, for example, is a monolithic solution for that. And it made sense, given limitations of data warehouse at that time, to have software that's much more complex and does all these transformations outside the warehouse, moves data in, et cetera. But then with the modern data stack coming into existence, it didn't really make sense for people to use Informatica on top of Snowflake. So things like DBT came into existence.
Yeah, I think thematically what you both are saying is it's gotten easier to work with these technologies. So, whether it's by way of using something like SQL or high touch to orchestrate sort of the operational aspect of this, the skills that are required on teams to own your own data in the context of a cloud data warehouse has been reduced to the point where maybe it's not super easy, but it's so much easier than it was just a year ago. Tejas, maybe we'll stay with you for a second on this. How is that notion of making this technology easier to use impacting the way teams are set up?
Yeah, that's a really interesting topic. So I think there's a few themes to pick on here when it comes to how teams are set up. So for one, I think as data warehouses have become a lot faster, as more and more data has landed in the warehouse, and as data in the warehouse becomes cleaner, there's more of an impetus for people around the organization to learn SQL and get their hands dirty with data one way or another. Actually, whether it's SQL or whether it's any sort of interface, just to get their hands in data one way or another. And I think that's a really interesting trend. We've talked at High Touch, we've talked to people in all sorts of departments that are like, oh, actually, I do have access to a SQL query, or I do have a SQL query that I can tweak. People in sales or sales ops or customer success or departments of an organization where you totally wouldn't expect folks to be that technical, maybe like 5 or 10 years ago, are actually like writing SQL, are tweaking SQL queries, are using tools like DI, or using platforms like Indicative, and are able to administer solutions like High Touch to solve the problem and the pain points that they're seeing across the organization. So I think one thing that we're seeing, one theme that we're seeing with the rise of the modern data stack from an organizational perspective is just democratization. And that's happening by the tools becoming more easy to use. And at the same time, the people are becoming more technical because the barrier to entry to getting into the space is massively reducing.
I think that's right. David, you go ahead, David.
Yeah, I completely agree, Tejas, with everything you just said. I think the fun part and the interesting part is that there's no such thing as like a job done in this space. To the stupid quote, like with great power comes great responsibility. And we see this, I was just doing some data analysis on the kind of universe of DBT projects last week. And you can clearly see when projects get to a certain size of complexity, we would count that in terms of number of models, right? Like when you cross the 100, 200 model mark, the need to run tests on your data and to document your data models, just is clearly there. There's a clear uptrend in usage of those features when project size, becomes more complex. So it kind of like that's the flip side of accessibility, is it then makes us kind of like raise our standards as data practitioners for what we're putting out there in terms of data sets.
Yeah, so I actually think one thing that's really powerful that's happening in data teams in particular. So the rest of the business, data accessibility is going up like crazy and more people are getting their hands on data. With that, I think data teams are actually able to focus on more holistic problems for the organization and take a more infrastructure lens to things. So figuring out how to enable self-service data access, figuring out how to implement things like tests and documentation so that quality control is in place. And think of these problems more holistically. Whereas previously, when the only consumers of these technologies like data warehouses and BI and stuff like that were the people who knew SQL well enough to get their query right before it runs for 3 hours, then we didn't have all these problems because it was just you, the data person, handling the data request and then responding with the answer, rather than now data teams are taking a much more holistic view of the world, where they have consumers all across the organization that are using tools that they are actually setting up and configuring, which makes them take a perspective that's much more similar to, say, a product engineering team building a product for actual customers to go into, like an application at a SaaS company, let's say, versus previously the data team was seen as more of a supporting function for other parts of the business.
David, I want to stay on this topic of data teams. I know you and DBT recently published a guide on sort of this role called an analytics engineer. What is an analytics engineer, and how does that fit into this notion of a data team?
Yeah, you could think of the analytics engineering role, or like the practice of analytics engineering, as kind of a glue function that makes sure that knowledge in the form of data sets are like disseminated evenly throughout an organization to all the people using data. And how that's done, in practice is through writing, quite clean data transformation models that are tested and documented. And all of that documentation is accessible to data analysts, to data scientists, to data engineers, to whoever else is touching that data. I think the interesting thing about the analytics engineering role is it's not new. It's just something that every consumer of data was previously kind of doing for themselves, right? In a low leverage way. So data engineers would transform data, analysts would transform data, ML modelers would transform their own data. But consolidating that and recognizing that this is a function, and you can really get high leverage if you have people focused on this practice of transforming data and disseminating the knowledge out, that you build from building clean transformations.
Does this impact how teams are structured? So, I've talked with a lot of chief data officers, CEOs, CTOs about what is the best model for setting up their teams, given the way their data infrastructure works. So I've heard of the cross-functional team, embedded analytic resources, dedicated data teams. I throw this out to both of you, whoever wants to take it. Is the notion of the data team from an analyst perspective archaic? Are teams being configured differently now that the accessibility of data, or the democratization of data, has been increased so much more substantially?
Tejas, I'm actually curious, because you're, correct me if I'm wrong, like more from the data engineering side, and I'm more from like the analytics engineering analyst side. I'm curious, maybe you want to talk about the data engineering perspective and we can kind of meet in the middle.
Yeah, for sure. So I think at High Touch, we actually about 80% of our buyers of the software are actually in like data teams, data professionals, versus the business functions themselves. And then within that, it's actually close to like a maybe 70-30 split between engineers being 70 and 30% being like analytics teams and stuff like that. So it's a pretty good variety that we see. What we see is data engineering teams, as in the teams that are managing the tooling, the infrastructure, the automation, let's say, not just more of the reporting side of things, are actually staying pretty centralized for the most part. And I think this is true up until the real enterprise. So until you're at, say, like massive companies like Fortune 500 companies. Or Fortune
Meaning at
100.
larger companies, it's more embedded, cross-functional.
Exactly. And you start to see vertical data engineering teams, for example, a data engineering team under marketing tech. And that's just because the problems across the organization get so different between the various teams that you start to see these embedded teams pop up as well. But what we see is a core data engineering team is just very much the case at a majority of companies. And I think that makes sense because if you look at what's happening, like take a look at this modern data infrastructure diagram that's pulled up, for example, there's just so much in flux and so much happening from a tooling perspective, from an organization perspective, et cetera, that affects so many different areas of the organization. It's just hard to make decisions about things like this. And it's hard to make large changes like this unless you have a central function that's looking holistically across the organization and making sure everyone's doing things in a standardized way. Otherwise, things can get a bit out of hand. But what we see is the consumers, like analysts and analytics engineers, et cetera, are growing in more departmentalized ways, which makes sense since the customers of data are growing throughout an organization.
Yeah, and I had a hunch that's that's what you'd be driving at. On the analysts and the analytics engineering side, like the important piece is having domain knowledge for the data that you're working with. So whether you're working within a centralized team or whether you're completely decentralized or whether it's kind of a hybrid model, the important thing is like you meet with the people who are ultimately consuming the data and you have a really good feel for what they need to get out of it. I can say, that was the model at BlackRock, kind of centralized, but doing a lot of work with the end users who are mostly traders. At Fishtown, we have that same exact model, right? Centralized data team, but people on the team focus on product or marketing, say, and embed with those teams, meet with those teams weekly, and are like really in touch with the challenges.
Yeah, I think that's probably an important clarification. I guess departmentalized doesn't mean they're necessarily sitting on the sales team itself, more that they focus on a certain domain area. And I think with the rise of accessibility to these tooling, for example, someone who's just using SQL can now do data modeling. They can also move data into Salesforce and create automatic pipes to do this using tools like HighTouch. And because the accessibility to do these tasks is going down, we're finding more business savvy people are actually able to assume those roles. Versus people who are previously focused on the coding side, the data engineering side of things. Now people who are just focused on the SQL side of things and we're working with the business customers all the time are able to actually take on those tasks.
Yeah, and I'm going to add. Sorry, one more thing, Tejas. Like, I don't think we can. I think we have to acknowledge like data engineers not writing ETL and now not writing like reverse ETL is like an enormous thing that like this entire setup kind of like stands on the shoulders of.
Exactly. Yeah, totally agree.
If data engineers are no longer sort of building that infrastructure, what is the role of a data engineer as we sort of look forward? Is that a role that you might describe as being a transitionary role in terms of as the stack evolves, as businesses evolve?
I can say one point from my perspective. I'm curious to hear what you say. What do you think, Tejas? I think it allows data engineers to do higher leverage work, stuff like orchestration of all of the kind of data flows and processes across an org versus writing scripts to pull data from APIs into a warehouse.
Yeah, so I totally agree with that point. I think the goal of any vendor in the data space right now that's trying to empower people with just SQL should be to try to reduce the amount of people companies need in data engineering over time, and allow those people to get closer to the business value and focus closer to those business problems instead. That said, what we find in practice is that SaaS tools don't solve all problems in an organization, and there's a lot needed in between different SaaS tools. So for example, at HighTouch, we have 40, 50 destinations, but sometimes people need to build an integration with an internal CRM or a financial tool that we don't support or something of the like. And the only real way to do that is to get your hands dirty and use like our custom destinations framework, for example, which requires a data engineer to actually orchestrate things like that. I think likewise, sometimes there are problems that don't fit directly in the landscape of DBT when it comes to data modeling. So someone needs to get their hands dirty into Python code or anything like that to do these transformations, or Spark, and then there can be a data engineer on it. So I think what we are trying to strive for as vendors in the space is to reduce the need for data engineering in particular, and to try to allow people to get through 90% of the problems without having to reach for more complicated engineering resources. But there are always going to be problems that are not generic, and as companies' size goes up, there's going to be more and more of those problems.
So that's a great segue. It sounds like because of tools like HighTouch and DBT, we're able to do so much more, and it's shifting the burden off of data engineers so that they can work on higher level functions. Let me flip that around for a second. What are some of the pain points that are emerging around data as we sort of solve this whole other slew of problems? David, you talked on validation and testing a moment ago. Are there others?
Yeah, one that I'm thinking a lot about is the metrics layer. So once you get to the point where you have normalized transformed tables in your warehouse, the accessibility and ease of creating those means that more people start to use these tables. More people may start to kind of roll their own transformations on top of it, and at larger, more complex organizations with more complex setups, you may have a few different definitions or tables for, say, the same metric, right? So people go looking around and say, which one is the right one, and you have to dig into documentation and all that stuff. So it's kind of a prioritization or like a filtering problem that you just have at scale to say, like, this is our one true definition of revenue, right? And that, while it seems like a simple problem, is super important. And I think companies are just now starting to get there.
I feel like that problem has existed since the beginning of data. I hear that one all the time. Certainly. Tejas, you're coming to this from a sort of the different side in terms of operationalizing a lot of this data. Are there new challenges or opportunities that you see when it comes to sort of your perspective, where you guys sit?
Yeah, so I think David tapped on this earlier, but basically as you get more powerful tools in the data stack, get more interesting problems in the data stack. So I think with giving people the power to move to make big data pipelines and move large amounts of customer data into downstream tools, whether it's an ad service or a CRM, that also gives users that previously weren't writing these big data pipelines the ability to, I guess, frankly put, mess things up in these downstream tools as well. So there's a lot of problems when it comes to how can HighTouch and how can different services help prevent these sort of issues in advance. If they do happen, help you roll back or fix these sort of issues, and even help you identify if issues in data quality actually happen throughout the stack. And that problem exists upstream of the warehouse in tools like Fivetran. It exists in the warehouse with tools like DBT and testing and Great Expectation. And it also exists outside of the warehouse or downstream of the warehouse as the warehouse starts to become more of a hub for data across an organization. So I think there's plenty of challenges around that. And that's just one example of how giving people more powerful tools also creates its own set of problems, which requires more and more tools. And there's sort of a circular loop there.
Yeah, when we first started Indicative and we were selling into enterprise businesses, we would occasionally get pushback that says we don't want to democratize data across our organization for exactly the two reasons that both of you are describing. Is that an inevitable tidal wave that companies just have to get over and accept the fact that democratization is coming no matter, and you can't hold that back, and that philosophically that is ultimately good, even in spite of whatever bumps and disagreements that come up from giving more people more access to data?
Yeah, I think democratization and the ability for users who can change, marketing, sales, et cetera, the business users to have ability to dive into this data is definitely good. Along the way, I think from a data engineering perspective, maybe thinking, wow, this is a lot of tools, or it's hard to see how this all fits together, or it's just a big mess, or a lot of different reactions might happen. And that's more a sign that the space is still being figured out. I think a modern data stack is materializing, but it's also still being iterated on. And that'll probably be the case for at least the next few years.
Yeah, this I mean the flip side of democratization is bottlenecks, and no one enjoys those. And at the end of the day, we need people, right? We still need data practitioners to uphold a high standard as that democratization is taking place. There's no like magical concept of self-serve.
Right. Whether it's a combination of tools, process, and combining those. Tejas, you just mentioned something which is a great segue for us, which is sort of how this entire ecosystem is evolving. And we've sort of talked a lot about how it's evolved over the last several years in terms of this unified stack or this notion of a modern data infrastructure. Maybe we can shift now to talking about sort of what the future looks like. David, I'll throw this one to you. Tejas just went. What are some of the emerging trends that we're starting to see, and where does the modern data infrastructure move towards in the future? And I'll leave it very open-ended in terms of time frame. You can hit any way you want.
I am really excited about real-time analytics warehouses. And so going back towards the warehouse as a point of innovation, I'm excited about those in combination with tools like high touch that allow you to get that data with very low latency out to operational tools that front end business users are living in. I can't help. I don't know if this is like a realistic metaphor, but I saw firsthand in a totally different kind of field what Zapier did for thousands and thousands of companies when it came out. With people being able to set up their own automations and have them do work for them in real time and not in some type of batch latency. And I just have this feeling that real-time analytics, real-time transformations, and tools like high touch, like that same type of thing, I think could take place here.
Tejas, go ahead.
Yeah, so massive +1 on that. I think that kind of as I mentioned earlier, I think all the innovation around the modern data stack usually happens in waves, and those waves are triggered by fundamentally new technology from the data warehouse itself. So I think this wave that we're seeing right now was triggered by the separation of compute and storage, and particularly not just the technology, but how accessible companies like Snowflake made that technology to the everyday company around the world. And that's why we were able to see solutions like DBT where it made sense to do all these transformations in the warehouse and potentially duplicate the data as well. Why it made sense to have solutions like high touch that allow you to do this automation in just SQL, et cetera. And I think really what it comes down to is there's a lot of smart people working on companies around the world, but fundamentally what they're bottlenecked by when it comes to data stack is the underlying technology that is adopted in a mainstream capacity that they need to interop with. And that layer is the data warehouse itself. And most of the use cases that we really struggle to implement on top of the data warehouse come down to how fast are people getting data into the data warehouse and how fast can we actually transform and operate on top of it. What is exciting that's happening right now is I think all the batch data infrastructure is getting a lot faster, which is really great and helping us work around this problem in many ways. So you can see case studies of companies like JetBlue doing even like couple minute type ingestion and transformation latency end to end with solutions like Snowflake and DBT. Many of our customers are loading data into the warehouse every 15 minutes, every 30 minutes, and even solutions like Fivetran have gotten a lot faster. We can run up to every minute at high touch as well. But overall, I think the biggest fundamental change will happen when the underlying warehouses change. And I think the big gap for warehouses isn't many of the things that's being talked about, like an app store on Snowflake or anything like that. It really comes down to fundamentally when can we have streaming SQL queries. And I think when we can have that, when we can have that through a technology that most customers have adopted, that will create a huge wave of new features, new players, new technology, new use cases for the data warehouse and for the data team across the organization.
I think you guys touched on an interesting point, which is the notion of the gravity around the data warehouse and the openness of the data warehouse in the sense that it's SQL and almost every tool can speak SQL, so to speak. And it makes me think about sort of the cycles that have happened in our ecosystem. If we think back a number of years ago, if you wanted to do all the great things that we can sort of do today, you had to buy a monolithic integrated like Adobe Marketing Cloud like stack. And the reason companies like Hightouch and DBT are having massive success today is because of the openness that exists today in contrast to an Adobe Marketing Cloud. So my last question for you guys before I'm going to ask Tracy to cycle through some of the questions is, are we going to see some consolidation or roll up with regards to these tools? I forget which one of you mentioned this, a Snowflake app store, so to speak. But is there a place in the future where this openness and this opportunity for us to build all these great tools begins to consolidate back into more monolithic based stacks?
I sure hope not, Jeremy.
Yeah, tell me about it.
I think the value of the ecosystem and the stack in combination with interoperable pieces, I think recent history has demonstrated that value in terms of adoption is much higher than the value of kind of vertically integrated kind of silos. Whether that truth continues to hold, I believe it will for the near term. Who knows what will happen past like 10 years out? We'll see.
Yeah, I think it's great for all of us if there's no consolidation, speaking from a Hightouch perspective, indicative perspective, and a DBT perspective. I think that we'll continue to see more interoperability around the data warehouse and allow like best of breed software for certain tasks to exist. But if you think about it and you zoom out, what we're seeing here with an explosion of data tools isn't different from what we're seeing across all fields with an explosion of SaaS tools. There's just more SaaS tools than ever in organizations. We know that very well at Hightouch, and that's in the data space or out of the data space. So that's the same in marketing, it's the same in sales, et cetera. There's just a lot more opportunity when it comes to giving people power in technology right now. And I think one thing that we will see though is right now, I think minor differentiation between platforms can make a major difference to customers. But as the space becomes more mature, the table stakes for a solution, whether it's an ETL or reverse ETL or data transformation or metadata or whatever it is, will go up. Just the table stake features and things like this will go up, and there will only be like a couple really renowned players, I think, in each space. Rather than right now, it's hard for a consumer to decipher what's going on from the outside because there's just so many players popping up left and right. And I think we see this level of consolidation in all space in the market. So I was chatting with a founder of a customer success software quite a while back as well, maybe 2 years ago. And they mentioned something similar. When they were starting their software, there were like 7 or 8 players that looked like them. And they all looked pretty similar. It was hard for customers to differentiate. It really just came down to which solution was seen first in a lot of sense, or which couple solutions were seen first. And then as time went on, there were only like a couple prominent players, which was like a 7-year, 8-year timeline in this case. So I think we'll see some of that, but I don't think we'll see, as David mentioned, like the data warehouse doing every single part of the stack. We've seen that happen before with, say, Microsoft stacks, Oracle stacks, and generally didn't work so well for the consumers. And I think if you look broader than data, what's happening here is not weird. This is happening to all of SaaS.
I totally agree. And I think, to be honest, it's tools like Hightouch and DBT that are making it easy for customers to choose the best-in-class solution, which means that customers have choice and they have the ability to plug and play with what effectively is build the perfect stack for them. Guys, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been a great conversation. I'm going to turn over to Tracy, who I believe has been fielding questions from our audience. Thanks very much, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, hi. So we've got a few questions coming in. I think we have time for maybe 3. There's one from Lucas, which is, are there limitations when working with a modern data stack due to the volume of data or real-time analytics? Whoever wants that one.
Yeah, I can take this one. So due to the volume of data, no, not really in any reasonable sense these days. Solutions like Snowflake are operating at massive companies with immense volumes of data. And that's just architecturally due to how they're set up now with the separation of the compute layer and the storage layer. It means those two layers can scale independently. So companies can have massive amounts of data and utilize all of Snowflake's compute resources, or they can have tiny amounts of data and still run their queries super fast, utilizing all of Snowflake compute resources. So I think when it comes to having limitations on volume of data, we don't really see that being the case today. When it comes to real-timeness of data, there are limitations there on how expensive it might be to do more real-time or lower latency processing on batch data warehouses. But I think that's quickly improving.
Another one on real-time analytics. How does real-time analytics fit into the current modern data infrastructure?
I think, we're at the early end of the adoption curve there, but certainly platforms like, Materialize, like Rockset are kind of starting to get out there into the market. And that's something at some point, I think we'll see, teams using those, I think often like alongside a warehouse like Snowflake or BigQuery, right? I don't think it's going to be an either or type of proposition.
And I have a question, which is, a couple things actually. There's one from the team, which is, how can I ensure clean, reliable data if I have a decentralized data team?
Yeah, good question. I guess the responsibility in that case would fall on the decentralized folks. Again, it really depends on what their function is that's decentralized, right? Like Tay just mentioned, it's kind of rare to accept at really large companies to fully decentralize data engineering. But yeah, if there's no reason why decentralized analytics engineers and analysts can't produce high quality data sets versus centralized, their work kind of remains the same.
Or maybe there isn't specifically a tool that allows that to happen or makes that happen. I think what you're saying is it's a process, it's ownership, it's responsibility. Yeah, it's not easy and it's not free. Yeah.
Yeah. People have to step up and do the work regardless of where they sit.
Yeah.
I'm going to do one last question, which came in from the team, which is, what are some of the biggest considerations to make when transitioning to a modern data stack?
I can take a stab at this one and then let you guys jump in too. I think a lot of it becomes, because there are so many choices that you have when it comes to what different technologies you want to plug into your infrastructure. Like most projects, it begins with the question of, what problem am I trying to solve? What are the use cases I'm trying to address with my implementation of modern data infrastructure? And by starting there, and I'll plug the infographic that you had open a minute ago, Tracy, which is, we've tried to create a visualization that helps customers navigate the ecosystem. And again, it starts off by saying, what is the problem I'm trying to solve? Then apply that using, frankly, this infographic. I'm going to ask my own question, and this is to Tejas, which is, how do you describe your category of software? I've heard it described as reverse ETL, as operational analytics. Is there a term that is becoming universal for the aspect of taking data out of the data warehouse in an easy way and putting into other tools?
Yeah, so I think when it comes to that in particular, moving data from the warehouse into other systems, reverse ETL is the term that's picking up most, at least like our customers most resonate with, and I think most naturally come up with. There are some other terms like operational analytics and things like that. We don't use them as heavily, and I think they are a narrower set of use cases for this type of technology, which really comes down to just moving data from the warehouse to various different systems. I think it's not as intuitive to come up with as a customer as well. Tons of our customers ask us on calls if they're not even familiar with the space. oh, is this the reverse of Fivetran or the reverse of ETL's process? But no one really comes up with the term operational analytics themselves. It's something a bit more complicated you have to think about to come up with and be too coincidental. So I think it's reverse ETL right now. We'll see how that expands as the capabilities of different players in the space expand and focus on different verticals, for example. So maybe if you want to take a broader approach, it's just data integration.
We're going to take one last question, a little over time, but one last one. This one's for David. From Teresa, which is, do you see analytics engineering doing just the transformation layer, or is it someone who is a generalist that works across the full stack, especially when the team is still small?
Yeah, on small teams, it's data teams of one to a handful. It's extremely common for an analytics engineer type of person to be doing their own like data engineering, right? With tools like, Fivetran and Stitch, HVR, and those types of integration tools, to be building their own transformation models in DBT, and to potentially also be building, BI reporting in your reporting tool of choice. So I don't think that's where most teams start, right? With one generalist taking on this kind of task of standing everything up.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting is sometimes we're seeing people without even a data engineering background or an analytics background taking this on themselves, just someone who's learned SQL in a past job out of need. Some of our customers, I think one of our customers in particular, someone in marketing, just stood up Fivetran, Snowflake, and HighTouch to solve some of the problems they had on the marketing side. And now they're hiring data folks, but we see that pretty regularly actually these days. It's definitely not the norm, but it's happening more and more.
I'm going to add my 2 cents here also, which is we often see, or we're seeing more often, that product teams are owning some aspects of their data infrastructure as opposed to dedicated teams, because we sit on the product side of this picture. That is more so being seen as a key part of their infrastructure from a decision-making perspective. And as the tools have become easier to use, they're owned by non-technical teams, which I think, when I think about where the future's going, I think that's sort of the inevitable aspect here, which is the need to have deep granular technical knowledge to be able to leverage data in a powerful way within your business is being handed over to purely business teams. Today, using SQL is incredibly powerful and sort of levels the playing field. Tomorrow, it may be something entirely different that doesn't require understanding even some procedural language or query language per se.
I don't think we can get to any other questions, but as we're out of time, so we're going to wrap up. Thank you to everyone who's attended, who's stayed with us for the duration of this event. Thanks to Tejas and David for your time and your generosity with all your answers, and to Jeremy for once again being the host of our webinar series on the modern data stack. The next one is on July 14th. That one's hosted by Snowplow. So we did one with Snowplow 2 weeks ago. They are hosting another one. Jeremy will be on the opposite side of the seat. So he'll be interviewed by Alex Dean, who's the CEO of Snowplow. And that, again, is on product analytics, but within the modern data stack. You can reach us at indicative.com, HighTouch at hightouch.io, dbt at getdbt.com. And don't forget your free trial at the end of this webinar. Have a great day, and thanks again for joining us.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Tejas. Great seeing you guys.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.